Chapter 9. The night Elizabeth was kidnapped, we later learned she had been forced to march up Wild Kiln Gulch to Dry Creek Canyon, a 3-mile hike from our home. Brian David Mitchell told her that he would kill her family if she didn't do what he said. All the way up the canyon, he told her that God had commanded him to take her. Elizabeth hadn't yet registered who this man was. She had seen him for only a few minutes when she first met him at a crosswalk outside the mall, and then briefly at our home. Brian looked totally different. He now had a long beard and a long hair, but Elizabeth somehow gradually was able to make the connection. "Didn't you help my dad do some work on the roof?" "Why are you doing this to me?" Elizabeth asked. Brian repeated, "God has commanded me to do this." That's all he would say. The hike took many hours, with a difficult steep incline before they reached the top of the canyon. It was dark and the night air was chilly. Elizabeth was still wearing her red silk pajamas and the pair of running shoes that she had been allowed to take. It appeared that Brian had spent months preparing for the kidnapping. He was carefully building a campsite that was mostly hidden by the trees and the thick brush of the mountains behind our home. He was still working on the site after he kidnapped Elizabeth. The shelter was trenched about 20 feet long, with logs for a roof, laid over with thick plastic garbage bags, and a tarpaulin camouflaged with dirt, leaves, and sticks on top. The structure was not where Elizabeth was held captive for 2 months. Rather, it was in a tent next to it, tethered between 2 trees on a cable that ran along a line allowing her some movement, but only as far as the cable reached. Needless to say, she had no privacy. She was treated like a slave, forced to wait on Brian and Wanda like a servant. They had given Elizabeth a paring knife to use when she cut vegetables. On many occasions, when she tried to use a small knife to cut through the metal cable, but she was able to shred only the plastic covering, not the cable itself. Wanda and Brian argued all the time, and were constantly ranting and raving. During one argument, Elizabeth realized that Brian had forgotten to connect her to a cable. Seizing the opportunity, she tried to escape, but Brian immediately saw her trying to run. "Where do you think you're going?" he said. Catching her breath, Elizabeth, who had been a very good runner before she was taken, simply didn't have the strength to outrun Brian, whereas Brian was somewhat of a health fanatic and exercised constantly to keep fit. As search teams combed the area, Elizabeth later said she could hear the sound of people calling her name, especially one of her uncles whose niece was familiar and seemed very close. Hundreds of people were within hailing distance, but she was unable to cry out for help, unable to escape. Brian bandaged his knife to remind Elizabeth what he was capable of doing. She was profoundly frightened, convinced that Brian would hurt her or her family if she disobeyed his orders to keep quiet. She was right there, but no one knew just how close. She may as well have been invisible. Helicopters scanned the terrain behind our house, and volunteers arrived from Montana with bloodhound teams that would sniff the entire area. We had given searchers clothes, pillowcases, and other items with Elizabeth's scent. None of the search dog teams were able to pick up a scent that led very far. One dog caught a scent just outside our home and followed it up a trail behind our house until it stopped at the upper road. We now realized that the trail was correct, but why the dogs never picked up the scent that continued up the hill behind our house is still baffling to us. Elizabeth and Brian walked the entire way up the canyon. One theory had been that Elizabeth may have been put into a car that had been waiting to take her away. For days, search groups headed up every trailhead near our home, searching the hills for a clue. Posters of Elizabeth's image and the words "Pray for me" and "Missing" across the top started going up all over Salt Lake City. Ed's sister Angela went to nearby Kinko's and quickly printed up thousands of posters. A $10,000 reward was already being offered by the Salt Lake police for anyone with information leading to Elizabeth's return. We wanted the police to expand the search beyond Salt Lake, beyond Utah, and into neighboring states such as Wyoming, Idaho, and even Oregon, where 2 teenage girls had been abducted and killed earlier in the year. The Utah Missing Persons Clearinghouse was a big help, distributing several hundred flyers to law enforcement in schools in neighboring states. The word was spreading, and our local story was quickly turning into a national news. We are particularly indebted to a local printer who donated hundreds of thousands of copies of the flyer that was seen around the country. On the afternoon of June 5th, Ed decided to face the media for the first time after Elizabeth was reported missing to give the first of what would become twice daily press conferences. Unable to hold his head up, begging and pleading with whoever had taken Elizabeth to bring her home. Elizabeth, if you are out there, we are doing everything we possibly can to help you. We love you. We want you to come home safely to us. To the person who has our daughter, I can't imagine why you took her to begin with. There is no reason that you should have taken her. Please let her go. Please, Elizabeth. Elizabeth. He tried to choke back his tears, but his grief was obvious and painful for everyone who'd watched Ed that afternoon. We were all traumatized. The police had informed us that the first 24 hours are the most crucial in searching for a missing child. Most children abducted by strangers are victims of pedophiles, and most often, if the abductor intends to murder their victim, they will do so in the first 3 hours. If a kidnapper is seeking ransom, there is usually some contact with the kidnapper within the first 24 hours. We had heard nothing, but we were certain Elizabeth was out there somewhere. Unable to sleep, we fasted, prayed, and kept searching for Elizabeth. Our daughter, Mary Catherine, the other victim and the only witness to this crime, was being questioned about what she saw. Police investigators spent much of the early morning hours trying to glean as much information as they could from our traumatized daughter. By 9 o'clock, more than 100 people were searching for Elizabeth, including family, friends, ward members, law enforcement officials, and other Salt Lake Good Samaritans. The only information they had was the description Mary Catherine offered of a white man about 5'8". He was wearing a light-colored jacket and white golf style that pulled over his eyes. He was armed with what Mary Catherine believed to be a gun. Mary Catherine loved her sister dearly. She would have done anything to help bring her home. Speaking openly to the police and trying to give as many details as she could remember, it was difficult for her to talk about the experience, but she spoke to whoever needed to garner information from her. There are so many things that come up after a child is abducted. There are not parents' initial comprehension. The National Center for Missing Exploited Children instituted the Team Adam Project, named for John Walsh's son, who was kidnapped and killed. As a team specialization in abductions, when a child goes missing, his or her information goes to a national information bank that services law enforcement agencies and the FBI. Team Adam and Project Alert had teams of specialists to help assess the situation. They can play a key role in helping families get through the experience. The organization has incredible teams of experts trained with amazing resources available for anyone who goes through a missing child crisis. However, many law enforcement agencies are unaware of how to handle missing children cases. Organizing a search dealing with the media. Handling the investigation, how in the world does a family know where to begin with when they aren't thinking clearly from the very beginning? Our family and some of our close friends became extremely involved in the Elizabeth Smart Search Center, organizing many of the local donations we needed to keep the center running and volunteers working. If it was too hot to stand in the sun, they made sure canopies were brought in. Numerous stories were relayed to us about the many times the phone would ring at the center, and it would be someone offering whatever we needed at that moment, free of charge. Food, water, thousands of posters, flashlights, batteries, communications devices, and so on. There were so many acts of such kindness. People were hand-making buttons with Elizabeth's image and a caption that said, "Pray for me." People started to wear light blue ribbons in their lapels. When Elizabeth missed her graduation from junior high school, her teacher's friends made a sign out of blue ribbons and tied it to a chain-like fence and read, "We love you, Liz." Eventually, companies offered to manufacture the buttons and ribbons for us. Charles, in a sign of solidarity and hope for his sister, were 3 blue ribbons around his wrist, and a heart-shaped bead on each. He wore his ribbons until Elizabeth came home, and then for a few months after, until they became so frayed and worn that he finally cut them off at the 1-year anniversary of Elizabeth's kidnapping. He even wore a button on his tuxedo lapel when he extended a junior prom. We made a point of trying to get to the search center every day to thank the volunteers, but we want to be sure that everyone who donated their time, supplies, and services knows how truly grateful we are for all you did. You will never know the depth of our appreciation. Your generosity overflowed, and our hearts were deeply touched by all of you. Within the first week, an additional $250,000 reward was announced. Raised from private donations, the reward would give to any person with information leading to the rescue of our daughter. Their generous contributions were one of our greatest blessings. Their gift made possible what we could not do on our own. Police Chief Rick Dent appointed Don Bell to head up the investigation, along with Salt Lake law enforcement officials and member of the FBI. Shriners Hospital was the first official search-centered site to set up after Elizabeth's disappearance. Shriners Hospital has always been kind to our community, and their allowing us to set up the search center there was very generous. Located just down the road from our house, it had the available space to handle the onslaught of volunteers who came by to help. The morning of June 6th, we stopped by to thank everyone who interrupted their lives to aid our search. It had been only 24 hours, but it felt as if a lifetime had passed. We knew in our hearts that this was the best way we could bring Elizabeth home. As gut-wrenching as it was, we had to keep the search parties going out and the volunteers coming in. We had to be there to support those who came out to give so generously of their time. The first few days always began with appearances on the morning talk shows. We tried to maintain a plea for persons who had our daughter to bring her home. The morning of June 6th, Lois fell apart during an interview on the Today Show. Normally a pillar of strength, the thought of Elizabeth being lost was more than she could bear, but she was willing to go through anything to bring Elizabeth home. Together we were two halves of a complete whole. The balance worked for us. It helped save our spirits. Since we had never had a need for a publicist prior to the kidnapping, it was hard to imagine that Elizabeth's abduction warranted hiring one. Yet the media coverage became so dense, the family simply could not handle the load. People were calling for interviews, statements, exclusives, and appearances. Neither of us had the savvy to understand how to make the media work to help us in our situation, but we certainly knew we couldn't bring Elizabeth home without it. We found true friends in Chris Thomas and Interpret Group, a public relations firm based in Salt Lake City, which had been referred to our family through Tom. The first few months were donated free of charge. But when the workload became a full-time job, Chris was handed the account. He managed our media, sometimes 18 hours a day for 9 months, until Elizabeth came home. Chris played a very important role in helping direct our family, especially Ed, through the media frenzy that seemed to be feeding on our misfortune. He was with our family so often that Lois came to refer to him as our fifth son. Ed felt as if he had found another brother in Chris. He acted as a buffer between the press and our family. There were many times that Ed simply wasn't able to face the cameras. Chris was there for the family. Chris understood the importance of working the press to keep the search for Elizabeth alive. He protected all of us from the media when sleep deprivation and our emotions became burdensome, and we stopped making sense. He felt as if the Lord had sent him to help us, and looking back, he was a tremendous help. Chris prepared us to go in front of the media, working with focus points we had prepared before during family meetings. He helped Ed focus on message he needed to get out in his 2-minute segments on the talk shows during the daily press conferences. Investigators continued to interview Mary Catherine, being extremely cautious not to push too hard so that she didn't have to relive the horror of witnessing her sister being stolen. Our family was deeply concerned for her well-being. We had received helpful advice from trauma counselors about how to reduce the stress she might have been feeling and coming up with details of that fateful night. There was a chance that she would completely shut down from too much questioning, rendering her unable to recall any specific details. Mary Catherine stood firmly by her story of what happened the night Elizabeth was taken. At one point, specialists tried to hypnotize her, but still she wouldn't budge from what she saw. Now it is important to point out that what Mary Catherine recalled was not necessarily what happened. The police were careful to avoid letting all the information about the break-in go public. Mary Catherine believed that she saw a man take Elizabeth at gunpoint. Initially, I understood that he tapped Mary Catherine on the shoulder, and when she turned over, she saw Brian looking at her nightstand. Then she saw Brian pull out what she believed to be a gun and point it at Elizabeth. Elizabeth said, "Why are you doing this?" Mary Catherine thought she heard Brian say, "Ransom or hostage." Elizabeth stubbed her toe in the darkness of the bedroom and said, "Ouch." She heard Brian say to Elizabeth, "Be quiet or I'm going to kill you." At this point, Mary Catherine was feigning sleep. Brian told Elizabeth to get some shoes for a moment. A light went on in the closet where Elizabeth would put on her running shoes. Mary Catherine believes that Brian walked with Elizabeth down the hallway and looked into her brother's bedrooms. They walked down the stairs and out of the house through the back door. Mary Catherine never knew which door they went out. A few seconds after that, she heard Elizabeth say, "Ouch," a second time. She believed Elizabeth had fallen. Only seconds later, Brian and Elizabeth would fade into the night. As this is being written, there are other details that we are not at liberty to talk about because of the pending trial. Mary Catherine is a very strong little girl, but outside of these investigations, interviews, we realized that she wasn't talking about Elizabeth at all, not even the good times they shared. Mary Catherine was afraid that people would want to talk to her about the kidnapping all the time, and it frightened her. Lois reassured her that it was okay to talk about Elizabeth without talking about the kidnapping. With little encouragement, Mary Catherine slowly started bringing Elizabeth's name into conversation. She started talking about the trips we would take in, sleeping in the same room, and the sisterly bond they shared. Mary Catherine wanted to focus on the wonderfully happy times we had together as a family, and this helped her tremendously to bring Elizabeth back into our home while she was gone. By Thursday afternoon, workers from both foundations had several volunteers running the Elizabeth Smart Search Center at the Shriners Hospital. They brought a copy of the search manual created by the Laura Recovery Center, instructing parents on how to run such an effort. Dawn Davis, a volunteer from the Texas Center and the sister of the volunteer had been first to arrive, flew to Salt Lake City to join the effort. They held a training meeting to direct the searchers on safety and organization of search parties, which was important because we would later be told that we could be personally liable if someone got hurt while searching for Elizabeth. Within 48 hours of setting up the center, help was coming from all over the area. We marveled at the number of people who were there to help. Almost 2,000 volunteers, family had rounded up were members, extended family members, and friends, are ranging for nearly 5 times the number of people using typical search. Did this give us an advantage? We certainly thought so. If Elizabeth was out there, we would find her and bring her home. The two foundations teams did their best to organize the search. They were very helpful. For the most part, we were unaware of all the details that made up the central command center that was functioning as Elizabeth's Smart Search Center. We stopped by the search center as often as we could, but we wanted to stay near the house in case Elizabeth tried to contact us or a ransom was called. Members from both sides of the family have primary contact and were part of the search staff. The teams of experts were capable and very dedicated. Many who lived in Salt Lake who wanted to come down to search were given the day off to help. Business owners were incredibly supportive, donating so excessively that we actually had a surplus of items. Donations came and helped to pay for the expenses. Volunteers headed into the hills on those hot summer days, instructed to look for anything suspicious and to contact Central Command with any leads. The search turned up every hair clip left behind on the trails. Band-aids, bits of cloth, barrettes, pieces of litter, and even a roll of duct tape. Anything that a young girl might have used, they found it. For the first 48 hours, nothing seemed to turn up to help bring us closer to finding Elizabeth. Then, around 7 p.m. on Thursday, a 22-person search group saw a man wearing a white t-shirt and a white baseball cap. He was pacing back and forth as if he was waiting for something. Someone shouted at the man, sending him scrambling into a thick brush in Pinecrest Canyon. Searchers then heard at least 2 gunshots. Searchers thought this was a breakthrough in the case. Search dogs were let loose and helicopters were dispatched to fly over the mountains to look for the man, the effort yielding nothing. At the end of each day, volunteers were debriefed about their searches. A copy of each report went to the police, another kept at the center, and a third was turned over to us. The importance of and need for trust among local authorities, the federal investigators, and the family was stressed. Hundreds of leads resulted from the search. The police worked around the clock tirelessly. It became apparent that the police, who at one point numbered over 100, had become overwhelmed as this entire situation was intense. There was some concern about the follow-up on leads. Some were not followed up on at all, and some were lost. Leaks to the media were also beginning to occur, yet another intrusion on our privacy and source of mistrust between the police and us. Chapter 10, Ed. The investigation process took a tremendous toll on me personally. As we mentioned before, the procedure in these types of cases is to look closely at immediate family members. No one is above suspicion. All sorts of rumors were floating in the press about our family. The plan police put into action was to exert enormous pressure on family members who might have knowledge about the crime. From that perspective, our case was not exceptional. After our home was sealed as a crime scene, the police turned the girl's bedroom upside down looking for clues. Had Elizabeth been corresponding with anyone out of the ordinary? Maybe one of the other children was involved in some kind of cult or organization that had an interest in abducting Elizabeth? As outrageous as it seemed to us, statistically, the likelihood was that a family member was involved. We, of course, knew that no one in our family was capable of committing such a horrendous crime. Unfortunately, when the investigators started looking at our family, the obvious thought was that I might be involved. In further questioning at the police station, they kept challenging my honesty and integrity. This was definitely one of the lowest points of my life. I hadn't slept for days after Elizabeth was kidnapped. I was unable to close my eyes without seeing my daughter's image. The police were pushing me to the point of breaking, which was their goal. If they could break me, surely I'd confess. But confess to what? I had done nothing wrong. As if it wasn't enough what Elizabeth's abduction had done to our foundation as a family. The painful effects of all this stress had put me in a state of profound despair. I was emotionally and physically exhausted, and I was finally at the breaking point. I had been crying uncontrollably for 3 days since the morning Elizabeth was taken. That night, 2 FBI agents had to help me up the stairs to my bedroom, since I was unable to make the climb on my own. A little later, around 11, Lois called my dad and told him she thought I needed help. He came over right away and suggested I get medical attention. The impact of what was happening was settling in, and my mind was overwhelmed by the situation our family was facing. I was checked into the hospital unable to stop myself from crying. By morning, I had suffered what my doctors would later tell me was a mild nervous breakdown. I was in my deepest despair, feeling completely helpless and unable to save my missing daughter. I was unable to function in any capacity, let alone offer security to Lois and the children. I needed sleep. I wasn't thinking clearly. I wasn't making good choices. They sedated me, then I checked in, but I kept right on crying. I just couldn't stop. I knew more than anything how much Lois and my family meant to me, regardless of how bad things felt in that moment. I had to get back to my family. I asked for an ecclesiastic blessing. My father came to the hospital with my bishop. The bishop gave me a blessing that I would be able to cope with things and that I would have the strength to wherewithal to get through the nightmare. I have received many blessings in my lifetime, but I was in real pain and in dire need to feel the comfort that only God can give. During my blessing, I felt that God spoke to me. The Lord wanted me to be home with my family. I realized that life wasn't always going to be sweet, but I knew in my heart that everything was going to work out. I got out of the hospital bed, pulled myself together, and went home. At that point, Lois' strength was the glue that held our family together. Our marriage had always been strong, but after I came home from the hospital, we knew that our connection had to get even better. Between the press outside our door 24 hours a day, the invasive line of questioning from the police and the press, and the pressure we were both feeling from Elizabeth's absence, the stress could have torn us apart. We were on the edge of all the time. This experience brought out the best and worst in all of those involved. Lois and I learned how to depend on each other for our individual strengths. When nothing tests you, it's hard to know how you'll react in time of crisis. Up to this point, we had lived in a pretty good and easy life. But the situation in which we found ourselves brought out the difference in our personalities and backgrounds, and we learned that with what each of us was truly made of, our strengths and our weaknesses. The searches continue with teams made of a fascinating cross-mix of people who make up our city. Doctors, students, tourists, construction workers, teachers, everyone seemed to offer some assistance. The one lead we were able to provide was based on what was missing from Elizabeth's bedroom, a description of the red silk pajamas and the running shoes she wore that night. The shoes were size 8, white with blue trim and with an unusual pattern on the soles. On Saturday, Lois and I faced the media once again, standing at each other's side. We knew in our hearts that Elizabeth was still alive. My brother Tom spoke on behalf of the family, echoing our belief that Elizabeth was still alive out there. He pleaded for people to check their basement, check their homes. Someone knew something of what we were certain. Of that we were certain. If you can hear us, we love you, Elizabeth. We haven't forgotten about you. We won't stop until you come home. Lois choked those words out as she faced the cameras one more time. It was painful to have to make such remarks. Why had we been targeted? We were still so perplexed about the nature of the crime. At 11 o'clock that morning, police gave out a composite sketch of a man they wanted to talk to, who had attended a number of Elizabeth's harp concerts shortly before she disappeared. We had never seen the man they were seeking, nor did this description fit that of anyone we knew. By the afternoon, that lead had proved to be yet another dead end. Police had found the man, but after questioning him, they were convinced he knew nothing about Elizabeth's whereabouts. We were so hopeful that he was the kidnapper. This was just first of many in a cycle of ups and downs. There would be numerous leads in the months to come that would turn out to be nothing. There was a disfigured body of a young girl found near the Great Salt Lake, bare bones that were discovered outside of Heber and a desert mound that turned out to be buried garbage. Every time we heard the news of a clue, our hopes were raised, only to be flattened as each one proved to be unfounded. Soon after, America's Most Wanted aired its first piece on Elizabeth's disappearance. As its name implies, the show highlights unsolved criminal cases, fugitives, and missing children. The show's host, John Walsh, was contacted in an effort to enlist his help and support in Elizabeth's kidnapping case. America's Most Wanted camera crews had been around our home since the news first broke, so we were hopeful that John would want to help in any way he could. Soon after the segment aired, tips started pouring into the show's phone lines. Walsh reported the latest information from the police that Mary Catherine had feigned sleep during the kidnapping and that the kidnapper didn't know she had seen him. Until just before the airing of America's Most Wanted that night, the police and I had publicly indicated that Mary Catherine had been directly threatened by the kidnapper, which was incorrect. John was a great help through the many months of the investigation, and we were very grateful for all he did to help our family bring Elizabeth home.